Hello and welcome to Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. My guest is Scott Richards, a fellow Australian who's an advisor on conflicts and international relations to governments and interested parties worldwide. With Presidium Network, he worked on high-profile hostage cases, notably in Afghanistan, and now works with No Ordinary Day, supporting people and communities impacted by war or injustice. We discuss the Taliban's transformation of Afghanistan into a nexus of extremism and terrorism, the group's relationship with Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, for starters, and the danger they present to a world that just isn't interested in facing up to that reality. Have a listen. Hi, Scott. Thanks for joining us today. Can you start off, please, by introducing yourself, as you can do that much better than I can, of course. Your relationship with Afghanistan goes back to the early days of the Republic. How did you get involved?
With Afghanistan specifically, at the time we were working in developing an anti-corruption task force. And I'd just come off some other initiatives related to special economic zones and economic transformation. And so we came in to provide assistance in sort of 2014-15 to the Ministry of Finance on anti-corruption, working with the oversight coordination body under Deborah Lyons as well. And that was kind of the beginning of a lot of the work. And when you're dealing with sort of the elements of corruption and those sorts of aspects, it very quickly moves into kind of the wider issues of Afghanistan. With the conflict itself. The involvement of other countries in political process. And from there, I provided some assistance around the law enforcement sector and also had time-to-time roles in some of the Doha aspects.
Oh, okay. So, been pretty deeply embedded for quite some time. But the past 3 years have seen the impunity granted to the Taliban become more profound than I think most people would have expected. What's your assessment of the situation in Afghanistan right now?
I mean, the Taliban have become far more aggressive in terms of their social policies, in terms of their very strict dogmatic policies. There has been no progress on issues related to women's rights. There's been, constant issues between the different ethnic communities in Afghanistan, and nothing has really improved. The economic situation hasn't improved. Their ability to engage, as a pragmatic component of the international community simply has not evolved. It's gone in reverse, dramatically and violently. It's the definition of a repressive society. And whatever hope that we had when they came in, in August 2021, it's gone. I don't think there's anything that can be gained on the way that we've approached it. And I say that as someone who's, when they had the Doha meetings in May 2023, I contributed to the speeches and papers of special envoys. We saw no progress.
And yet that impunity has extended, the Doha 3 meeting earlier this year, 2024. The Taliban said they laid down conditions, didn't they? If there's any civil society or women's groups there, we're not coming. So the United Nations, which is supposed to represent all of us, says, okay then. And so women's groups, civil society were out, Taliban were in. How can you possibly expect progress or any movement of the needle at all when you just roll over like that?
You can't, and there's a lot of functional problems with the UN's approach in that. I mean, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, when I categorized the Taliban actions, they violated at least 22 out of the 30 principles. Yeah. So at that point, the UN has to ask its own existential questions about its own values if it's willing to compromise. And each one of these conditions or tests the Taliban does is them testing the international community. Where is the line? And so far, we haven't shown them a line as to where we're willing to restrain them, where we're willing to, even impose fines on the $40 million a week. Like, if you don't conform, and do this or show progress on this, we will reduce the amount by $1 million a week. Mm-hmm. There's no incentive for them to behave. And their ultimate strategy is really holding the nation hostage. And they become more and more absurd, banning polio vaccines. There's just really not a limit to where they will go. But the United Nations, by continuing to violate its own principles through the practice of engagement, is detrimental to the United Nations full stop, and to any other crisis where we have an extremist group take control of the population.
Well, indeed. And Afghanistan, as a result of that, has become an incubator for international jihadism and terrorism, and a haven for around, it's close to 24 groups, I think, that the United Nations Security Council Sanctions Committee has documented. And it's been written about for years now. That's just a fact that, the pushback is over. I think it's an accepted now part of the Afghan geopolitical landscape, and yet no one seems to really want to take any notice of that. I mean, you and I were talking a little bit earlier about the mourning, the official statement from the Taliban about the loss of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, confirming that these are fellow travellers. The Taliban figures went to Tehran a few months ago to shake hands with Hamas figures there. So why is it that this is allowed to continue without any, as you say, without any consequences?
I mean, we really saw when it came down as of August. There was a brief moment of optimism that the Taliban might be 2.0. And that was fairly much ended on September 7th. And then from that moment forwards, it dramatically got worse day by day.
Well, tell us what happened on September the 7th.
That's when they formed the official Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And that's when we saw the Pakistani ISI chief try to come in and kind of restructure that around. Yeah, so we may have anticipated Barada was coming in, but we got Hibatullah. And Barada may have been a more pragmatic figure, certainly in the period of August, as the central bank was collapsing, as these things were happening, you could have conversations, at least, that gave the appearance of being constructive. But by September 8th, that's when we started to see the jihadist camps move in. That's when we first started to see camps going up in Kunduz. And for a long time, we were talking about what was happening in Kunduz, and nobody wanted to pay attention. And so when you flag these things, particularly to the Americans, or awareness of people that had gotten on those flights that were direct threat to the United States, nobody wanted to know. You couldn't say the words Al Qaeda, even though the first, awareness that was the Bin Laden boys had returned was in October 2021, which I think has been acknowledged by the UN now. And so the denial, because it was such a disaster. And I think there's a problem with a lack of willingness to take accountability, that you deny it for as long as you can and try to dodge the media cycles and hope it doesn't get worse. But so the figure of over 24 is more or less, is correct. Because you have sort of 8 to 10 Al-Qaeda camps, and there's probably 30, 34 camps across the country. You're talking Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, JNIM. You're talking absolutely everyone. Hamas has been in there. Hezbollah has been in there. And these camps aren't operating independently of the Taliban. I mean, they determine who goes where to what camps. And we know that they've been having meetings in Tehran. None of these things. But it's just so politically uncomfortable. But the price of that discomfort, as we just brought up Sinwar in that speech, as they've said many times before, they feel it's their duty to support Hamas in their jihad against Israel. And they've made another call to jihad. What do we think these camps are doing? They're not, they're not going there to learn hobbies and arts and crafts. They're going there to terrorists. This is not
to learn how to kill people, and people like you and I, and most of our listeners, I would imagine. But let's unpack. You've started to do it already, but let's unpack Project Taliban. What is it? How is it linked to Al Qaeda? There was a lot of stuff over the 20 years of the Republic where there was a lot of denial about the link between Taliban and Al Qaeda, an effort to make Taliban out to have been duped by Osama bin Laden. They of course he was there, but they couldn't say anything about him because he was their guest, but they weren't involved in the project, which I don't believe. So What's your view, Scott? Some people like to even say that the United States created the Taliban. Let's unpack it.
So what a lot of people don't understand about Afghanistan, it was very much a crucible where modern jihad was formed after the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt towards the end of 1981, which was followed by the arrest and imprisonment of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So when these figures were released, number of them went to Afghanistan. You know, Osama bin Laden had been there earlier. Zawahiri had been there earlier, although Obi obviously wasn't arrested in Egypt. That's where they had met in that period. So we get, you know, elements of the Libyan fighting group. Those people went and fought there, then go back to Libya. And so there's this bloodline of jihadism across these groups. They're not disparate. And this becomes meaningful today, which I'll explain for reasons in a moment. But then, so, you know, in the 90s, I think Taliban formed in 1994, and they very quickly formed a relationship with Osama bin Laden. There's a mutual pledge of allegiance that was renewed multiple times between each other. So the idea of playing sort of dumb on Osama bin Laden is unrealistic and untrue. The Taliban, in some senses, have said that lying is what they do with foreigners. It's just how they are. So that Al-Qaeda relationship, that brotherhood is very, very deeply entrenched for the last 30 years now. And then the idea that they don't have the same mission, because ultimately these are super theological movements. And their goal is, you know, part of the argument with the Taliban is, well, they haven't really attacked anyone outside of Afghanistan. The notion of that, obviously, with the attacks happening, you know, with the TTP in Pakistan and the number of forces that they're training, they're allowing Afghanistan to be used as a base to project against other countries. So that's not truthful either. They themselves, you know, there are allegations of sort of, you know, limited operations and participations of the Badri in other countries. But they're certainly involved. They're certainly involved in the planning. They're certainly involved in a great deal of the things that go on. They become something different as well when they fuse with the Haqqani network, you know, who were the super interlocutors of organized crime and terror. And so they're now probably the most sophisticated terror organization, jihadist organization on the planet by far. But we've also given the capabilities of a nation state. They have Scan Eagle drones. They have a lot of the systems that were abandoned. So they're very, very sophisticated, which gives them very, very sophisticated planning capabilities. There's no monetary controls there, so they can move cash to other groups like they have to AQAM. We've seen AQAP and the Houthi Connect, you know, earlier this year, which was said to be something that was impossible. So the whole topography of jihad has changed. And there's a lack of willingness to understand how it's changed. And that changes again with the Israel-Hamas conflict, as we touched on. So it's, to this day, you can't really distinguish the Taliban or the Islamic Emirate from Al-Qaeda now. You've got people like Wasik and Tajmir, who are what we call dual hatters. They are Al-Qaeda. They are Taliban. They are in very powerful positions, and Al-Qaeda is all throughout the Islamic Emirate. So they're indistinguishable functionally. They have functionally indistinguishable belief systems. And I think this is something important to touch upon, is why does engagement fail? Part of the thing that people struggle to understand is, why are the Taliban so obsessed with their pure version of Sharia? And this is with all of these entities, is with Iran as well, is the idea, it's a prophetic concept that in the Quranic prophecies, there's 73 sects of Islam and 72 of them are wrong. And there's only one true. And so the Taliban have said time and time again, we will not compromise on our pure vision of Sharia, because they want to be, to their mind, that 73rd sect. So they're never going to change. They're never going to compromise. And they've said, we'll never compromise Sharia. They'll never codify law. They will never become something that we would understand. So if, you know, the model of the IRA is that you give them political participation and then they have to concede violence. The Taliban aren't going to do that. because their mission is something different.
Mm.
And there's a lack of understanding of the role of belief in some of these super theocratic movements. The same thing would be true of Christian evangelicals, who have a very particular idea of what end times look like, and want to see those end times because of the inherent prophecy.
Mm.
And so when people can't understand it, when our diplomats cannot understand the religious motivations of these groups, they can't possibly hope to engage with them to bring them into a rules-based order that the rest of the world operates on.
Well, indeed. I mean, there are some very sophisticated people in the diplomatic space who do understand that, but I think that maybe the political, economic, geopolitical, realpolitik considerations don't allow that thought process to come to the fore. But I'm also interested in your views, Scott, on what the Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan means in practical terms. You've talked about the training camps, but there's also the movement of money and arms. Probably, I'm assuming, using the very well-honed transportation links that have moved heroin around the world for years to Al-Qaeda affiliates across Africa and the Middle East. And so it becomes symbiotic, doesn't it? I mean, the linkages are almost unbreakable. And as you say, one is the other. Can you describe, from your knowledge and study of the situation, what you see going on there?
I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, we've known, and that by saying we, it also means that the various formal official agencies that monitor these things also know. So the routes for bringing fighters into Syria, was originally Damascus airport until it was struck after the October 7th attack. Then it was a ground route using exactly those narcotic routes. We know that jihadists come in on commercial flights into Kabul airport and then are divided up and sent to their camps. We know that money has moved into to the Houthi. We've seen JNIM pledge allegiance to Hezbollah. So I mean, if you were, what ultimately has happened with Afghanistan is that for whatever reasons, the Biden administration is holding to their side of the Doha deal, or that the Talibs breach. Even, it's a very small document. Even the very small elements of it, they do breach. There's been no restraint on them. There's been no restraint on them for holding Ryan Corbett prisoner for over, the 2 years on arbitrary detention with no charges. So we've created this, the West has created a climate where any jihadist group can establish a training camp. They'll go to what they call work experience in Iraq or Syria, and then return to their home countries, completely unhindered. And it could be because the magnitude of the problem is such a failure at such catastrophic levels. But Al-Qaeda came back very, very quickly. And so after the killing of Zawahiri, the rift between ISIS and Al-Qaeda mended tremendously, because that's what brought them back together. So we have this kind of misnomer of ISKP becomes the convenient threat, because for a long time you weren't even allowed to say Al-Qaeda when it came to the US administration. Put those words in, they don't want to hear it. But the reality of Al-Qaeda, I think, has more or less become undeniable. But meetings with Hezbollah, I think 2022 mid-June, say I would have said to Hezbollah that we are not the Al-Qaeda of 2001, 9/11, of box cutters. We're an Al-Qaeda that understands AI, blockchain, and all these things. Yeah. They have the very convenient arm of an ISKP counter-terror mission that's financed by the US and others. And nobody's willing to strike these terror camps, because part of the Doha deal is that the US forces wouldn't attack Afghanistan, the exemption being Zawahiri. And they've kept to that, even though the proliferation of camps, we had reports of the Hamas spokesperson, Abu Qaeda, there in November 23, an MOI, a multi-source corroborated, but it's become an untouchable place. So if you are going to go and plan an attack, there's no safer place to do that than Afghanistan.
Well, can we put that into? Well, exactly. Let's put it into the context of what's been going on in the Middle East since October 7. 2023. I mean, a lot of people were saying in the aftermath of the return of the Taliban to power that this will mean another 9/11. But we're beyond one-off spectaculars now, aren't we? We are at conflagration. So should we be looking at what's going on in the Middle East as a result of the impunity is a well-worn word, but the freedom that terrorism now has, thanks to the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan?
I mean, Africa's, you've got Burkina Faso, Mali, huge Al Qaeda problems. You get people coming around trying to talk about a Taliban-like solution with Somalia. The United Nations was talking about trying to normalize with the Houthi. So there's this point at which the act of the act of enabling the Taliban to become the administrator of Afghanistan, and the Talibs continuously putting sanctioned people in charge of things like dabs. This model has failed. This model has made everything more dangerous. Al Qaeda have been, before October 7th, 2023, Al Qaeda were quite quiet about their plans. But in their sort of Al Qaeda newsletters and other things like that, Saif al-Adil comes out and openly says, if the United States puts boots on the ground and backs Israel against the war against Hamas, we will attack America. I think his exact words were, we will erase all of the bases, all of the presence of the United States in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So they're openly telling the West, if you do this, we will attack. And now with the THAAD systems going in, it becomes that question is for Al Qaeda, is that line crossed? Because that THAAD system requires American boots on the ground. There's reason to believe the Malaysian scientist is back in, very plausible reason to believe he's back in Afghanistan, the one who was working on the anthrax biolab by the airport. He was released in 2019, went straight to Afghanistan.
Where else
so we're talking
would you
about
go?
where exactly? We're talking about a much more complex threat. And we're also talking, when I looked at October 7th, it has the fingerprints of Al Qaeda. Osama bin Laden's original 3-point plan was first, draw America into a long war that loses American lives and costs money. The second was that by having Muslim blood spilled there, enrage the Arab world. And then the third part becomes, based on that rage, form the caliphate to run global jihad from Afghanistan. That vision's basically been achieved. But so the attack on October 7th is so outrageous, so violent, so horrible. It demands Israeli overreaction. It demands that the Israelis, so horrified by what's been done, that Netanyahu, quite an extreme figure in his own way, will cost enormous amounts of civilian casualty in Gaza. And that will isolate Israel, which has happened tremendously effectively. And Netanyahu is in a position where he's expanded his war. And so even, in the Iraq war, we'd have, language about the Crusaders and whatever else. But this has got more the dimensions of the holy war that everybody is all too eager to build upon, and the anti-Semitism that comes out of it. Saying it's 9/11 again isn't hyperbole. It's exactly what it is, and it's exactly intended to spill into a regional war. And strategically, if Israel were to become isolated and were to be defeated, or a grinding 20-year war like was with Iraq and Afghanistan, that's the last barrier to the caliphate in that area, next to Jordan. And we've watched throughout this year Al Qaeda stirring up protests, causing problems in Jordan. Remove those two countries from that theater, then it's the caliphate, the extremist caliphate movement could just sweep.
But then, how do you analyze the spread, extreme success of the spread of the narrative? We know that anti-Semitism is not very far below the surface of Western society, as well as a lot of Middle Eastern societies. The co-opting of the language has been superb. Genocide and
Hmm.
Holocaust, and these words that were very rightly, I think, used to describe what happened to Jewish people, communities,
Mm.
societies en masse during World War II, when after which we took up the slogan "Never Again."
Hmm.
But the way that this language has been adopted, for instance, on Western university campuses,
Hmm.
without any recognition of the true nature of the ideology, how women are treated, how
Hmm.
LGBTQ people are treated. What does that society really mean? Well, the Taliban is providing the example, and yet
Hmm.
people don't want to see that either. How do you look at the way the language and the narrative has been adopted and spread with such complete success?
Um, it's this is a complex one to answer correctly,
Mm,
um, because the circumstances of Gaza have attracted sympathy from the jihadist movements, and I think it is fair to say that Palestinians and the West Bank have not been afforded the right to have a life of dignity.
mm,
But at the same time, genocide is a very specific threshold, and my family, our grandmother founded the LA Holocaust Museum. So genocide and that notion is very, very close to us. So it's not genocidal threshold, but the conduct of the Israeli response has resulted in disproportionate civilian death. That's
yeah.
not a genocide, but the amount of death and factored into Hamas's strategy would have been every dead Gazan is propaganda. But every dead Gazan and every dead child is still a dead child. So I've
Yes.
worked very closely with Palestinian communities, and literally today trying to help a family of children who have got third-degree burns
Mm,
evacuate from there, because children are innocent, they're non-combatant. We need to build bridges of humanity, and Hamas is a scourge on Gazans and Palestinians. They came into power in 2006, banned elections, did throw LGBTQ people off buildings, did throw other political groups off of buildings, murderous and horrible. And they're not freedom fighters, they're not resistance fighters, they're part of a global jihadist movement. They have no interest in in really a two-state solution. Their original charter was the destruction of Israel. Um, but that doesn't mean that there aren't peace builders within Palestine, West Bank and in Gaza, and many Gazans who are horrified by Hamas. But the
mm,
idea that these campus people can come along and say Hamas are resistance, rape will never be resistance, terrorism will never be resistance, because the moment that you kill civilians, you're not targeting somebody who's part of a government or a combatant for whatever grievances that you may have. Um, so they're on the wrong side of the Palestinian people by supporting Hamas. If you want
mm,
to support the Palestinian people, there are plenty of good people who are pro two-state solution, who are pro constructive relationship with Israel. Those are the people that you get behind. You get
mm,
behind deceleration of violence, not acceleration of violence, but the co-opting of genocide language or whatever else. We live in a world of magical thinking, where people that don't understand the politics or how things occur will go on the internet and read crazy stuff on QAnon or some of the stuff that comes out on Twitter, and it gives them an explanation for how the world is. And so anti-Semitism is always kind of an lurking gateway drug to conspiracy theories.
yeah.
Um, and with the internet the way it is, blaming, we've had ridiculous space lasers. We've had, blaming the weather patterns on the Jewish people. It's absurd.
Mm,
Um,
mm, mm.
but this
The
this dangerous conflation, because anti-Semitism can lead to white nationalism, anti-Semitism can lead to Islamic extremism, anti-Semitism can take you down any number of radical movements. And the Israeli, I think over 77% of Israelis want a ceasefire. And so this idea that the Israeli people are driving this violence isn't true either. The
Yeah.
750,000 people protesting, for a hostage deal. So the Israeli people are getting caught unfairly with this rise of anti-Semitism when they themselves are protesting for a ceasefire or protesting, and in many respects often trying to help. When it comes to situations like injured children that we're dealing with today, I find many Israelis are very helpful, because a child is a child.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, and I think a lot of that is lost as well. The scenes that we've seen for the past year have been heartbreaking in the extreme, but Palestinian people in those communities who are anti-Hamas have also had their voice, their freedom to speak out removed from them over the years, but most specifically over the past year. And that is also something that I think is very misunderstood. Nobody would wish this situation on anyone, but the way it has been co-opted and reverbed, it has been really as distressing, I think, because now nobody knows where it goes.
I mean, that's absolutely true. And the co-opting of language is deliberate, sophisticated. If someone had said to me, if I'd watched a movie with 13 simultaneous attacks across a day, I would have said that movie's just not realistic. You have no idea how difficult a simultaneous attack is. So that immediately tells you that Hamas couldn't have done this alone. And you look at the information operations for Hamas were prepped and ready to go almost immediately to try to capture the narrative after October 7th. I mean, I speak to the hostage families, frequently. I've worked, on a number of the elements around the ceasefire proposition, around the hostage negotiations. And to see that narrative turn so quickly, this was so highly organized and sophisticated, well beyond the capabilities of Hamas. And it's distressing, I think, for everyone seeing the violence glorified or seeing, the anti-Semitism rise. As to where does it go, because it just justifies more atrocity against each other. And very easily this war and something, deceleration of the war is something I've been heavily involved in as well across this whole year. Because the possibility of it spiraling, the impact that it will have across the Middle East, it's already reshaped the Middle East. We're watching defense pacts change. We're backing the Iranians into a corner when people, so what could they do? Well, if I was the IRGC, I would just mine the Strait of Hormuz. There's your oil supply is just done. And then you don't even need to just keep your ships there. It's just, they've said openly they would attack the oil production facilities. It's such a dangerous scenario. And then the isolation, the anti-Semitism, the US elections, the polarization, the dissent, the fragmentation of that, the breakdown of the rule of law that we've seen around this conflict. It's incredibly challenging. Some of the discussions I've had, the issue, whether or not you like UNFIL, whether or not a lot of people don't understand the UNFIL mandate in the first place. You can't shoot at peacekeepers, because we normalize that. Then the casualty of this war isn't just Israelis or Lebanese people and Gazans. The risk is rules-based order, because then we have no standing to, if al-Shabaab kills peacekeepers, or attacks a UN site, or, that's the real risk, because Putin can come along and say, well, these, you have an ICC and ICJ judgment, two separate things, and you didn't do anything about it. So why should anyone care about the war against me? And so as much as Israel has pursued its enemies, as much as Israel needs its own security and needs a guaranteed security, in a two-state situation or however this evolves, we can't compromise on international human rights law, because then we have no argument for the Taliban either. We can't compromise on international law. We can't compromise on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because then we have no standing anywhere. And then all of that order that we built out of the horror of World War II collapses, that we designed to protect ourselves. It's really complicated. And it's so emotional for so many people that reason gets left by the wayside.
Well, indeed, and but it's not just reason; it's all of the things that you're talking about. I mean, you and I have heard rumours in recent weeks about how Britain, the government of the United Kingdom, wants to re-establish some sort of diplomatic presence in Kabul, which comes after the closure of the embassy in London. What do you think that's about? We sit back and we watch China and Russia and Pakistan and Turkey, Japan, because they probably don't really know what else to do. The Indians are wondering what to do, but the Brits, you'd kind of think, would know better.
You would hope that they know better. I mean, Afghanistan under the Taliban is an unrecognized government. De facto, it technically means illegitimate. It doesn't mean it's like, oh, it's just a government of whatever else that we haven't quite recognized. Legally, it means a government that hasn't ascended to power through constitutional means. So you can't open an embassy in a country that's not recognized. They can open a mission of some kind. But given the Taliban haven't progressed anywhere on the most basic and fundamental rights that are required to be a participant for diplomatic engagement, given that they target to this day individuals who are on ARAP applications who work with the British forces, murdering these people with some frequency, lying about the amnesty, still participating in the narcotics trade, fostering jihadism and terrorism. It doesn't make any sense. You could say, well, you know, Afghanistan has all this mineral wealth. Kind of, you know, it's there, but extracting it's not going to be easy. And then if the Islamic Emirate were to collapse, which is, you know, a probable outcome of a government that can't manage an economy, then the contracts that are formed for that mineral extraction will likely be invalidated by what comes next. So to kind of think that we're missing out, Russia and China is going to get this stuff, I very much doubt they'll get much out of the ground. I very much doubt in 3 to 4 years those contracts will be worth anything. You know, the Chinese are in reality very risk averse. So it makes no sense.
Well, I agree with you on the mining and minerals side of things for the Chinese, but in the meantime, what they are doing is enabling and helping the Taliban to create a surveillance state, the way they are next door in Pakistan. And as they go dark, you know, these new rules that no living things can be photographed or put on TV. You know, the country is becoming darker and darker, and so, you know, that old saying, you know, first they came for the journalists and nobody knows what happened after that because there's nobody there to tell you. So we won't know what's going on, but the Chinese will make sure that the Taliban know everything that's going on so that then their repression becomes tighter and tighter. So the Chinese will get, I think the plan is to further expand Chinese power into Afghanistan, maybe to run the Belt and Road project through there. Hasn't worked out too well in Pakistan, but people there still seem to think that they have the wherewithal to protest to some level. I don't think that will happen in Afghanistan. So there is the Chinese have a project there, and they are enabling the Taliban in order to facilitate their own agenda.
I find it very peculiar they're going down this path because their super surveillance state is, you know, Xinjiang, where with the Uyghur Muslims, and it is. You have Abdul Haq Ghori, Al Qaeda, ETIM up in the north of Afghanistan. You know, you have training camps, you know, for ETIM. They've quite, you know, it's quite well known. They went to Syria as well and had training camps there. Abdul Haq Ghori is, you know, he's old school Al Qaeda, was with OB, you know, associate of Osama bin Laden's, still with the Talibs as well. So this idea that you could, unless the Chinese are hoping they can find their enemies by leeching off of the surveillance that the Talibs put in, and they got a back door or something, and they're identifying threats, it makes no sense given given how aggressively Chinese re-education works on Muslim extremists
in China.
In China. So why would you create a nest of this, give it powers of surveillance, give it these strengths, give it these capabilities, when it's threatening Tajikistan, we've had an increase of ISIS cells in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan sharing a border with China. Why would you do that? Either, you know, they've become confused about their own safety and security, or they have a plan that you know, manipulating or using the surveillance for their own ends. It doesn't seem very clever to me. This short-term thinking that we do see in national security or whatever else, you know, trying to keep the lid on the pot rather than turning the heat down, just keep turning the heat up and keep trying to push it down, doesn't work. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, the Japanese are always, you know, trying to do the right thing by people. I remember that from dealing with them when I was in Afghanistan. They were very humanitarian oriented, very productive, and always. They may also just not understand what the reality of the Taliban are. The Taliban, you know, when you meet them, can be very charming. I'm sure you've had that experience as well. They can be, you know, on that level, but they're not. They have their goals. They consider human life disposable. They use violence instead of diplomacy. Why would we expect them to change? To the Talibs, they beat America in their mind.
Yeah.
And the Americans and the whole world is bowing down to their conditions. They probably do feel like they are a prophetic society, that they are the true Islamic society, because look at the success. Yes, their economy sucks, but look at the success that they had. They beat the entire world. And enabling that seems terrifying to me.
Yeah, but you know, it's the Chinese agenda is also to push back America. You know, it's an anti-Western agenda, as we've seen since, you know, Ukraine took off. So why not? Why not enable it? Enabling it without any recognition that it could come and bite them as well. I think maybe that's what it's about. And also they might have that attitude that Tom West, the recently removed US special representative to Afghanistan, said to me, I said to him, I can't understand what US policy is with Afghanistan unless it is just so that you have a geographical outline around global jihadism. Is that what it's about? Knowing where all the bad guys are corralled. And he said, you know, in all the meetings that I've had, I've never heard it put quite in those words. And so maybe that's what the Chinese are thinking as well. If we know where they are, then we know where they are without recognizing what Project Taliban is.
They might be the only ones with that intelligence because, you know, you have Al Qaeda in charge of passport office under the Haqqanis. So they can create identities. And this was known, you know, back in September. It was one of the first things they started doing was creating identities. Yeah. And so we have no root identity on who any of these people might be that go through these camps or come out with these camps. But, you know, the Chinese super surveillance may be the only way of identifying who they are.
Well, yeah, maybe. And it might be the Chinese who are providing them with the technology to do that.
I mean, it's, you know, the idea that the Americans...
than not.
The idea the Americans would have a picture of sort of who's who is just not possible. The throughput on the camps, 2,000 people a month, 31 camps operating. It's a lot. It's industrial scale, and they're directed back to their home societies. But the overarching question has been: is given they built this infrastructure, what is the trigger? What will set these people in motion? Is it U.S. support of Israel? Because the Iranians just said recently, any country that supports Israel against Iran will feel the consequences. So far, we haven't seen very many consequences from Iran. You know, their very large missile attack resulted in no fatality and no real damage to Israeli infrastructure or IDF infrastructure. So we haven't seen the movement of the jihadists that we know are in Syria. We know we are seeing some activity in Iraq, between Iraq and Syria, but we haven't seen what this monster of Afghanistan is going to give birth to.
Yeah.
We know it's pregnant with terror, but we don't know the due date.
Yeah, what's the gestation period beyond what we've seen in the past year? Exactly. Yeah.
It's a terrifying possibility.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, how does this all end? But, how long is a piece of string, right? Yeah.
I mean, there were various triggers that we, I guess we posited. Ground invasion of Lebanon, we expected to be met with a heavier response. We anticipated that the jihadists in Syria would go after Golan Heights because that would open another front against Israel. But Israel's capability at I don't like the word decapitation, but it's used a lot in terms of removing leadership from threat groups. But I don't tend to like that kind of language in violence, because violence is violence. But they've been very effective at eliminating leadership, in Hezbollah. Very effective at that strike in Iran at the guest house. And so whether that's decelerated these movements in their response, and whether Saif al-Adil was telling the truth that, about what his line for action, or the Bin Laden boys' line for action with Hamza as the emir now, we don't know. But it costs money to have those camps. It costs money to train those fighters. It's an investment. It's just, we don't know what the maturation date of that investment is.
Yeah, indeed. Watch this space and be prepared is all we can say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Scott, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And your insights and analysis is priceless. So thank you again.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's always good to talk with you and talk with somebody that understands Afghanistan as well as you do, and has been paying attention the whole way through, when many other journalists are sort of a bit like the administration stepped away, or the editorial left Afghanistan, which is even more dangerous to the world. So I certainly appreciate having you continuing to work in this space.
Well, yeah, it's uphill, because I have been told by editors that no one's interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan anymore. And really, I just think if you're not, then you're missing the whole picture. It's very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Again, Scott, thank you. That was conflict consultant Scott Richards. We talked about Project Taliban, Osama bin Laden's three-point plan, the tragedy of the conflagration in the Middle East, and the nexus of terrorism and jihadism that, with the return of the Taliban to power, has put Al-Qaeda back in the ascendancy. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. That's all for now. I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Bye-bye.